Meanwhile, the Germans mopped up the final pockets of resistance. Overwhelmed by ferocious Luftwaffe bombing raids, Warsaw finally surrendered at 2 p.m. on September the 27th. The German victory had been achieved with the loss of only 44,000 casualties, compared to total Polish losses of nearly 1 million in killed, wounded, and captured. 2 days after the launch of the Polish invasion, France and Britain, in line with their earlier guarantees, declared war on Germany. However, Poland's geographical location and the swiftness of the German victory prevented them from intervening directly. The French briefly advanced across Germany's western border, but upon hearing of Poland's defeat, they withdrew. In September, the first detachments of the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, began taking up positions along the Franco-Belgian border. By the end of the month, 13 British divisions were in place, numbering over 150,000 men. 21,000 vehicles accompanied the BEF to France, along with almost all of Britain's heavy military equipment. The French and British troops dug in and waited for the expected German attack in the west. No attack came, and for the next 8 months, hostilities would be limited to sporadic artillery duels and bombing raids. The next major German offensive was directed not at France, but Scandinavia. In April 1940, German troops moved to occupy Denmark and Norway. They were sent to protect Germany's supplies of iron ore, which were shipped out from Sweden through the Norwegian port of Narvik. By occupying Norway, Germany would also secure bases for air attacks against Allied shipping in the North Sea and keep the Royal Navy from the Baltic. The Allies had already realized that severing Germany's iron ore supply would cripple the Nazi war machine, and they were simultaneously planning their own operation in Norway. The Germans narrowly won the ensuing race. On April the 9th, German troops landed at Kristiansund, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. Supporting airborne assaults were made against Oslo and Stavanger. This was the first major air-land-sea operation in history. On the same day, and in the space of 4 hours, the Germans occupied Denmark. By April the 16th, Germany controlled most of southern Norway. Despite heroic resistance, Norway's largely militia army had been unable to prevent the German capture of their coastal cities. Over the next 3 days, British and French troops landed at Namsos, Narvik, and Andelsnes. In the south, they advanced as far as Lillehammer, but were then repulsed and had to be withdrawn by early May. In the north, they pushed the Germans out of Narvik. However, the Allied campaign was doomed by poor coordination, especially between the navy and infantry, while the total air supremacy achieved by the Luftwaffe proved decisive. The outcome of the Norwegian campaign was a foregone conclusion. Even before the fighting had finished there, the Germans were preparing to launch their greatest gamble of all, the invasion and conquest of the West. After his lightning conquest of Poland, Hitler had hoped the Allies would accept the German victory, just as they had earlier accepted the occupation of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Once he saw they were determined to fight, he had resolved to launch a Western offensive as soon as possible. He knew the Allies would need time to mobilize fully and to draw on the resources of their overseas colonies. If given this time, they would be too strong for Germany to defeat. It was essential, therefore, that the German army should attack while it still had the initiative. His first strategic priority was to defeat the French army in the field. Once this was achieved, he felt confident that Britain would sue for peace. Much of Hitler's military outlook had been shaped by his time as a frontline soldier on the Western Front during the Great War. Many of his generals had been staff or artillery officers during World War I, and as such, would not have fought in the trenches. On this basis, Hitler distrusted their opinions and frequently overruled them. Indeed, all his military initiatives to date had been taken against the express advice of the High Command. Each one of these had succeeded, and for Hitler, these successes amounted to victories over his own generals as well as the enemy. Hitler's decision to go to war with Britain and France deeply dismayed his commanders. They neither shared his grand ambitions of conquest nor believed the army was strong enough to realize them. Their opposition to Hitler was weakened after his run of successes. The High Command was also indebted to him for restoring the army's power and prestige. Hitler could also count on the support of the rank and file, who hero-worshipped him. By the spring of 1940, Hitler's leadership was secure, and the army's loyalty was guaranteed. On the 21st of March 1940, Paul Reynaud became France's Prime Minister. 2 years earlier, as Minister of Finance, he had effected major improvements in the French economy. Aged 62, he now found himself at the head of a government and a country that had long been torn by bitter political divisions. Militarily, he was a hardliner against Germany and wanted France to adopt a more aggressive attitude. Upon taking office, he immediately cooperated with Britain in planning and executing the Allied intervention in Norway. Yet time and again, Reynaud's initiatives were blocked by his numerous enemies. He was also at loggerheads with his senior military commanders. He had long argued, though without success, for the formation of armored corps in the French army. The eve of the German offensive found Reynaud's government virtually paralyzed by disunity. Before becoming Prime Minister in 1937, Neville Chamberlain had been Minister of Health and Chancellor of the Exchequer. He believed that peace in Europe could best be achieved by making concessions to Germany, even though he had a deep personal dislike of Hitler. It was a belief shared by many people in Britain, and when Chamberlain returned home after signing the Munich Agreement, he received a hero's welcome. But while appeasing Hitler on the political front, Chamberlain also oversaw British preparations for the possibility of war. In 1938, he introduced rearmament,